Hi, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you here to the event Moonshot Thinking in Silicon Valley. My name is Nicola Blaumer, and I'm the program director of the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles. If we are told Thomas Mann, the writer and builder of this house, that we are sitting today in front of flat glass screens and talking to each other, he would hardly have used the word moonshot thinking, but the thought would certainly have been bizarre to him. In any case, it's great that in this pandemic times, we are able to fall back on technical devices that were invented in California and which bring us a little closer together. I'm very grateful that we are connected with Obi Felten and Professor Ulrich Gumbrecht, two outstanding figures from the world of digital innovation and excellent scholarly research. Both are connected to us from the Bay Area and will talk about what makes the culture of Silicon Valley so innovative and what has made it not only a center for technical development, but also for a new culture of thinking. They will be moderated by Milena Merten, who's linked to us from Düsseldorf in Germany. Milena Merten is a reporter for ADA, Germany's platform for life in the digital era and the economy of the future. Previously, she was a staff writer for the Innovation and Digitization Department of Wirtschaftswoche. Milena Merten graduated from the Holzbring School of Business Journalism and wrote for Handelsblatt and Die Zeit. Before I hand over the spotlight to Milena, I'd like to introduce our two guests. I'd like to thank most sincerely our partners from the Goethe Institute in San Francisco for their support, as well as Benno Herz and Boris Scharschmidt for the great collaboration. Finally, I would also like to thank our sponsors, above all the German Foreign Office, who have remained loyal to us in this difficult year. Dear Milena, dear Obi, dear Zep, wonderful to have you. You have the floor.
Hi, thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Nikolai, and thanks for having us. I'm really glad to be here with these two exciting guests, which I will introduce in a minute. Before we start, I would like to welcome everyone watching and invite you to share your thoughts in the chat. Please feel free to post questions, and we will try to pick up as many of them as we can during this conversation. Nikolai, you mentioned it. We are tuning in from different places. I am here in Düsseldorf, Germany. It's already dark outside. Obi is tuning in from San Francisco. Ulrich Gumbrecht is in Stanford. And still we can be together and come together in this kind of virtual space, which is awesome, but it's also not new, although many people have tried it out for the first time during these months of pandemic. But virtual collaboration has been there for quite a while. And yet many founders and programmers and investors are somehow drawn to this place that's called Silicon Valley. Everyone wants to be there to work together, collaborate, and build the next big thing in technology. And we would like to discuss today, what is it about Silicon Valley that attracts so many people? What is the appeal of moonshot thinking that prevails in Silicon Valley? And lastly, is Silicon Valley actually still the place it used to be, or it promised to be, or is it maybe about to disrupt itself? So we have a lot of discuss about, and I am really happy to introduce our guests today. First off, I'd like to introduce the woman with the probably most Silicon Valley-ish job title out there. She is head of Getting Moonshots Ready for the contact with the real world at X, which is the team at Alphabet that develops self-driving cars and internet balloons, which she will probably tell us more about in a minute. And she's been living in Silicon Valley for quite a few years now, traveling back and forth between San Francisco and London. So she has kind of an inside perspective on the area, but also a look from the outside. So I think that makes you a wonderful expert on the Silicon Valley. Please welcome Obi Felten. Hello.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, Milena.
And I'd also like to introduce our other guest, who is Ulrich Gumbrecht, or Sepp Gumbrecht, as he calls himself. He is a professor emeritus of literature at Stanford University, and he has been at Stanford since 1989, so longer than Google and Amazon even exist. So he spent all those years at what many people consider to be the heart of Silicon Valley, because many ideas and businesses started there. And I am really, really glad to have him here today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you. I mean, especially as I could stay in my same place.
That's true. No traveling needed today. Yes, let's dive into it. And as I said, please feel free to post questions in the chat. I will look into it while we're speaking. Sepp, you said if Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the great German philosopher, were still alive today, and he would ask himself where to find the world spirit, he would probably find it in Silicon Valley. Why?
Well, I mean, this was a question to provoke, and it's the question opening a book that came out last year in German, in Switzerland actually, but in German language, and it's called The World Spirit in Silicon Valley. And in the first place, it's very strange, because if you think of Hegel, who is so much the philosopher of the spirit, and the spirit is normally something that doesn't need place. I mean, when we talk about the spirit can be everywhere. Spirit has no specific place. But Hegel was completely obsessed with this question, what the place of the spirit is, the spirit that dominates in the present. And actually, he did that for the first time in 1807, when he was a young, university teacher. He was not yet a professor at Jena. And he saw Napoleon Bonaparte, who had just, the French emperor, who just occupied that part of Germany, on horseback, riding through Jena. And then he wrote to a friend of his name was Niethammer, I have seen the world Geist on horseback today. And counter to what most people think, I'm deeply convinced this was not a metaphor. And he really believed that Napoleon, whom he admired in spite of being German, but there was no Germany as a nation state, that Napoleon embodied the Weltgeist. And later on, actually, modest as he was, and most professors are very modest, as you know, Hegel thought that really the Weltgeist was at his chair in Berlin. When in the 19 teens, he became the chairholder of philosophy at the university that's today named after Humboldt Universität. And he had a whole theory that this is where the world Geist was. And now, I was taking this question, and I was saying, so if Hegel would live today with this obsession, he was the only one to say where the world Geist would be. Let me put it this way, I don't know what he would say, but he better say it is Silicon Valley. Now, what is the provocation of this being said by somebody from the humanities, as you say in Germany, Geisteswissenschaft? The provocation that I meant is that we normally don't associate the type of thinking, the type of intellectual activity going on in Silicon Valley with what a philosopher like Hegel would have called the Weltgeist. Yeah? You would say, no, it has to be, to say provocatively from a Stanford perspective, in the Harvard philosophy department, or in the philosophy department, Obi, where you were studying at Oxford of Cambridge. And my thesis is, although I'm completely outside, I mean, I cannot write code, I'm not part of Silicon Valley in any active sense, that precisely this type of mental activity, intellectual activity, this type of thinking that I'm completely incapable of, is what changes the world today, what has had over the past decades and maybe unprecedented global impact. And this is the provocation I want to have. It's a double provocation in my sense, because I think most of my colleagues would profoundly and even bitterly disagree with me.
But what is it exactly that you mean by this thinking, this special way of mindset?
Mostly, later on I will get into the more professorial mood and will brag about the humanities and arts, and I will not translate it now always as Geisteswissenschaften, that's what it is at Stanford, which are pretty good, but I'm not referring to ourselves. I'm referring to the people, specifically, of course you cannot isolate them, but I think the cooperation that I'm referring to are the people producing writing code. Because writing code, whenever they talk about writing code, this is their sign. Yeah, they move their hands like having their hands on the keyboard. But this writing code is really the activity. And to go one step further, if you allow me, and I try to not always give this full Vorlesung here, but when you talk to them and ask them, so how would you describe specifically what you're doing when you're writing code? They describe it as a predominantly intuitive activity. Yeah? This is why they use the hands. They would actually say your fingertips are always a second or a fraction of a second ahead of what you can process. And if you plan it too much, if you don't allow yourself to let go, it will not be good. That may actually be not so different from a great traditional philosophical author. Yeah, Hegel, which is actually kind of interesting. Hegel had a stutter. Hegel had a speech impediment. And yet people were saying that his Vorlesungen, which became really famous in Berlin, were the greatest when he was able to let go. With the speech impediment, you have a hard time to let go. But whenever he managed to let go, then it was the greatest. And the books that we have today by Hegel, with one exception, are actually based on notes from his Vorlesung. You get my point? So it's not so far away, the type of production, to what I believe is going on here in Silicon Valley and all over the world. Silicon Valley is not the only place where people write code.
Yeah, I think this act of writing code and the people you were talking about, Obi, are the people that you work with every day at X. And I was wondering, the team you're working with is concerned with moonshots, with radical innovation. Can you explain what exactly do you do to come up with radical new ideas? What is this approach, and what is so different about this approach?
Yeah. So I work at X. It used to be called Google X until we spun out of Google, but we're still the innovation lab for Alphabet. And we call ourselves a moonshot factory. And in the beginning, that was sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because can you really systematize innovation? Can you think of innovation like self-driving cars or internet from balloons or delivery drones as something that you could get out of a factory? And of course you can't. Like, each project is very special and unique, etc. But the mindset that's behind it, of can we tackle really big challenges in the world with the help of technology, is a thread that definitely runs throughout all of our projects. Many of them sound like science fiction when we first start, like self-driving cars. Even when I came to X 8 years ago, people said, oh, it's never going to happen. It's going to be decades, maybe never. And now they're becoming part of our reality. But of course, many of them also don't succeed, which is to be expected. So the kind of that tension between trying to be really audacious, but also accepting that you're going to fail quite a lot of the times, I think is actually one of the things that's a key tenet in Silicon Valley.
Let me just one example, Obi, to illustrate what you're saying. I believe, for me, automatic translation has always been a big object of desire, right? And that would be wonderful, both to have it, or to be translated. But having thought about language all my life, until 15 years ago, I think it will never, never, never happen. And today, when I see, for example, text of my own Google translated, 5 years ago, they were okay. They started to be okay content-wise. Today, I can say they find an equivalent of the way I'm writing in German or in Spanish when I'm not writing in English, that I would not be able to write. I mean, the degree of sophistication in these completely moonshot-like ideas is absolutely unheard of.
Yeah, I mean, that was a long journey. And interestingly enough, is when they changed the approach, the breakthrough came from, instead of trying to understand and break down the sentence, they just applied machine learning, and they fed it lots and lots and lots of examples. And then over time, the machine got better. And the first corpus they fed into that new machine learning based model was actually the proceedings of the European Union, because they get very precisely translated into many different languages. So that's what's at the heart of it.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
What was the threshold with deep learning, I mean, with machine learning?
Sorry, so what do you mean? What was the threshold?
Yeah, no, it's a question to you. Do you have a date for this? I mean, I have heard it, but I've forgotten it. What was the beginning?
Oh, when did it happen? I think I was already at Google, so probably like late 2000s. I joined Google originally in 2006. So, but you can probably Google it, and it'll tell you the history of machine translation.
But you said it, that this is something that seemed impossible, or it seemed like science fiction for a time, and now it's.
This would never be possible.
Yeah. And so I think this tells us a lot about the mindset for the people who've been working on this, to, aim for or think very big, think very ambitious, and then try to get there. And I think one big element of this is taking risks and being willing to fail on the way to success. Mm-hmm. How do you implement a culture that really encourages this kind of mindset?
Yeah.
Let Obi talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very counterintuitive. When you look at children, they're very comfortable with failing. So when you see a toddler that's learning how to walk, they try, they fall over, they try again, they fall over, they try again and fall over. And then somewhere between that childhood and when we become adults and we become more accomplished, we focus more and more and more on success. And we think of failure not as just something to learn from, but we think of failure as something to be avoided. And so we develop this really deep-rooted fear of failure that's very real. People are afraid of losing face with their colleagues, or losing their promotion, or maybe losing their job. Or if you're an entrepreneur and you're running a company, you're worried about the entire company going down and all the people that are attached to it, etc. So those fears are very deep-rooted. So you actually have to do quite a lot to address them. And I wouldn't say we've completely conquered this at X. And I don't think you can ever get rid of the fear either. And I think the fear is helpful because it keeps you sort of a little bit paranoid, a little bit on your toes. If you assume you're going to succeed, then you're much more likely to make stupid mistakes, and you want to make smart ones. But there's some things that you can do. So the first one is just accepting that you're going to fail. So there's a great quote that is often attributed to Thomas Edison. He probably never said it, but it was something like, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. Mm-hmm. So if you reframe it from failing to learning, then suddenly it opens up new possibilities and it's much less shameful, etc. So accepting that many things are not going to work, setting up experiments where you rigorously test it out. And scientists do this, of course, with the scientific method all the time. Although I think really interesting, even in science these days, they're very focused on success. They're very focused on getting a Nature paper out, and very few people ever publish null results because it's difficult to get those published, and you don't progress your academic career. So I think that's like another whole question in science. But in theory, the scientific method is a really good framework. The second thing is, how do you focus on the hardest things first so that you find out as fast as possible if something's not going to work? Again, that's very counterintuitive. When we make a to-do list, we gravitate towards the things that we know we can do, and then we tick them off and we feel really good, and we tell our boss or we tell our friend that we've made some progress. But that's almost fake progress if later in your project you discover something that you can't solve at all that sinks the entire project. Mm-hmm. And then the third one I would say is, if you can be honest and transparent with yourself and with the team about what's working and what's not working, and really having sort of moments of assessment. So that could be setting criteria up front of when something is going to fail, when are you going to bail on it. So at X, we call those kill criteria. Lots of people set success criteria, so do we. So we love imagining what the world looks like when we succeed. But it's also really helpful, I think, to set a kill criteria, which is sort of the floor, you know? So say you want to build a new product and you want to reach hundreds of millions of people. Is it okay if you just reach 2 million, or is that not enough, right? So what's your floor? And like that's sort of where the kill criteria come in. And then finally, sort of pausing once in a while, especially when you're running at full tilt, full pace, like many of these teams do. You know, the pace of life is definitely sort of pretty hectic here. And the image I like to use for that is a tiger beetle moment. So a tiger beetle is this beetle that can run so fast when it goes towards its prey that its nervous system can no longer deal with all the incoming information. So once in a while, the beetle has to stop, look around, see if the prey is still in sight, and then sort of reorient it and run towards it. And I think that's a really good way of thinking of it. So even if we're like moving full tilt towards our goal, once in a while to sort of step back and ask ourselves whether this is still working or not. And then the final thing I would say is like sharing very openly what works and doesn't work. So in company cultures especially, people tend to only ever talk about the successes. And that teaches everyone that it's not okay to talk about the failures. And you actually have to reverse it, because people naturally talk about their successes. You don't have to encourage them, but you do have to encourage them to talk about their failures.
Mm.
Yeah, okay. I would want to say, I mean, whatever your plan is, but so I don't want to set it apart. I mean, Obi is in a world where ultimately, the ultimate product is success. Is a product that sells as a market, and I have nothing on earth against it. But the university is a different place. I mean, the university, well, if you say the university produces something, you use a different meaning. It's not a product. I mean, the university is supposed to produce qualified, highly competent persons in different fields. So for
and
that,
papers.
Huh?
Well, and papers and books.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, as it is a large institution, it has an internal pressure. I mean, like you have an pressure at a culture, but it's a different pressure. I mean, it's a pressure much more about a way of qualification, a ladder you have to climb to get papers published that nobody will read. I'll give you a nice example. I mean, the average number of readers for an article published in a peer-reviewed journal in the humanities and arts, a peer-reviewed, very good journal, is lower than 6. So that's very interesting, because you write something, you work half a year to write something that very few people will read. But if you place the article in that peer-reviewed journal, it will be good for your promotion. Now, what I'm saying is that this culture, this internal culture, is counterproductive for producing new ideas. So I will give you 3 counter proposals that I think characterize Stanford more than European universities, not in the UK, in continental Europe, that I know. Maybe also characterizes Stanford more than the Ivy League universities, because Stanford clearly, statistically and everything, has caught up in the past 30 years. It's the Ivy League universities. I mean, our self-image is that today we have only one competitor as a university, and that's Harvard. Anyway, so in the first place, I think, I profoundly believe that. In the first place, you should cultivate what I call riskful thinking, to understand about the university, to promote, to allow for the development of ideas that do not have a practical context yet. The more crazy, the better, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, the university has this freedom because we do not depend on products that are marketable. I mean, it's very good if Stanford produces something that's marketable, something gets produced and Stanford gets income from the patent. That's very good, but it doesn't depend on that. So you can practice perhaps more in the humanities and arts than in engineering and the sciences, this riskful thinking. You can say this idea is crazy enough to be supported. Not this idea is too crazy to be, it's crazy enough to be supported. I think this is very important. In the second place, I mean, I had cultivated as a professor of undergraduate and graduate students, competitiveness. Yeah? I mean, something that is the anathema in Europe. Competition is very bad. Competition is very evil. Competitiveness in the sense that when a student was telling me, well, you know, before I start really my own argument, I will give you a long summary of an important seminal, as we are saying, essay that Michel Foucault, who many people think was the most important Geisteswissenschaftler humanist of the 20th century, has written, and whom I admire very deeply, all the more so as I knew him personally. But my tendency was to say to the student, look, I mean, if you write a paper and have no ambition to be better than Foucault, don't even start writing the paper. I mean, the likelihood that you will be better than Foucault is very, very small. But why would you write a paper if you think, you know, this is the limit, I cannot be better? I mean, as a feedback, you may say this is overloading people. My experience in this past 30 years, my Californian experience was that most students accepted that. Under the condition, the first condition, that there is no risk. You can't do riskful thinking if there's no risk of failure. And then you can try to be better than Foucault. And the word that you use around Silicon Valley, that's enabling. You tell them, okay, try to be better than Foucault. If you don't, I still love you, or I still support you. You're still my student. You can still get, but this kind of always thinking, oh, no. And thirdly, this is something I'm quoting a fabulous student of mine who just last week sold his first startup in the 1-digit billion category, and he's 23 years old. And I would love to know whether it was 9.99 or whether it was 1.0. But anyway, as my wife was saying yesterday, it doesn't make much of a difference existentially. He was saying the lemma of Silicon Valley, including Stanford, is not anything is possible or even everything is possible, but rather, and I will explain the difference, nothing is impossible. Because when you say everything is possible, at least this is how I understand this sentence, you have something that you want to achieve, like automatic translation, and you work towards that. And I mean, as I've been saying before, as you would say in Brazilian Portuguese, I adore automatic translation. It's absolutely fantastic. But if you say nothing is impossible, and I think this is a significant limit, you include the possibility of things that you haven't even imagined, that may just happen in the process. And you can say that in Germany better than in English, die einem Zufall. Yeah, I mean, so you're producing something, you go somewhere, you want to resolve the problem, for example, of automatic translation. And halfway through doing that, as you were saying, you all of a sudden discover an interesting deviation, you follow this deviation and arrive at a possibility that was never among your intentions. And I think, and we will go back to historicizing Silicon Valley, but in the best moments of Silicon Valley today, it's not geographically exclusive, but this can happen. Yeah? You will not only realize successfully what you wanted to produce, but all of a sudden, as Felten etwas zu, you start thinking about something. I would say even within the humanities, under this spirit that you had not planned. And this is why, if I had to design a banner for Silicon Valley, it would be nothing is impossible.
Do you think that's because it comes from the hippie culture? I mean, I'm sitting here just next to Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco.
That was
and
exactly
that's some of the roots.
What I was thinking, yeah, because this whole Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, is rooted in this kind of counterculture. And you mentioned craziness as no idea is crazy enough to pursue it, or it could be not crazy enough to pursue it. So do you think that these are still elements of this counterculture that still prevail in Silicon Valley?
In the first place, I think we all agree on that. I mean, the three of us, not everybody who's listening to us, I hope. It would be horrible if everybody agreed. But there is a question, of course, whether this is still the case, that we will, I think, discuss among us and with people who are listening to us during the hour that is remaining. But I mean, I think there are two stages. I mean, what we call today, and retrospectively already, Silicon Valley, I think, is something whose beginning we could date in the 1930s and 1940s. And I think the first thing we can associate with Silicon Valley is the idea of the startup. I think this is very, very important. And this is actually a person who invented that. And this was Frederick Terman, who was a dean of engineering at Stanford. Stanford at that point was a good West Coast private university. It was not the Stanford of today. Nobody outside California would know Stanford. Nobody from Massachusetts would ever, trouble his or her mind to go to Stanford. It was a good university. But it was a university in a completely agricultural area where the best possibility to make income was wine production. And I mean, do I like wine? But nevertheless, Stanford had always been, for random reasons, I think, a de facto technical university. Stanford, even today, is as much a technical university as MIT. So they produced engineering students. There were no jobs for them. And this is when Terman started with the idea of the startup. He launched the idea of a startup, asking the few local, institutions with some economic power to help young people with crazy ideas to at least try and see whether they had a chance. And one of the first startups, literally, were Hewlett and Packard. Hewlett and Packard in 1939, the famous thing, always everything starts in a garage in America that ends up being successful. You can still see this garage in Palo Alto. I personally doubt it was the real garage, but little doesn't matter. But this was startup, and what they were first producing had nothing to do with electronics. And then, I think, when this got going and really was catching a certain rhythm in the 50s, 60s, then it came together, it converged with hippie culture. Yeah, and I mean, there's nobody could possibly say would electronics have happened or not without hippie culture, but certainly this convergence between something that had pre-existed quite successfully. Hewlett Packard garage of 1939, there's no hippie culture, and then you have to go through World War II, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, the hippie culture has an enormously intensifying impact. And in that sense, Obi, although we will never know, but I think that there is a likelihood that what I think has been so productive to encourage, the crazier the better, encourage not only everything is possible, but nothing is impossible. I have a hard time to imagine that historically without this ingredient, without this component of hippie culture. Plus, I have a super talented student who is writing exactly this story as his dissertation is almost ready.
Excellent. We look forward to reading that.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a beautiful American French named Corey Dansereau, like dancing, Dansereau. Mm-hmm. So that you don't think I'm inventing, I'm making him up. He really exists. He's really
we believe you.
It's not like I imagine the impossible.
So, but you already mentioned that we've spoken about many positive aspects of working and living in Silicon Valley, and the aspect of risk taking and going into new ventures and thinking big. But if we look at the current state of Silicon Valley, there are also some, I think, very serious problems we should also talk about. Zep, especially if you look at Silicon Valley as a fascinating and inspiring place, you might notice it is also a very male and very white place, right? So only very few startups by female founders get venture capital funding. There have been quite a few reports about toxic working environments also at Google. So do you think that this really is an environment where creativity and innovation can thrive in the long run, and a better world can be designed? Because that is, for many of founders, the aspiration.
Of course, is much more a question for Obi than for me. I mean, not only because I have been retired for 2 years and can do whatever I want to do, but and Obi is in the workplace. This is obviously true. I mean, my first guess would be, but then I mean, Obi is really the specialist here. My first guess would be it is neither less nor more toxic than other working environments. So I don't have this idealized thing, everything is fine in Silicon Valley. I had actually, before we had our pre-discussion yesterday, I had never thought much. I mean, typical male, and I admit, typical male, my generation, I never thought much about that. But yes, for example, the students, I remember the undergraduate students who I thought were very hot. We had a major minor at Stanford, computer science major, main component, and comparative literature minor. They were not all of them male, white, etc., but yes, I mean, there was a predominance that was more than suspicious. So yes, but I don't think it's specific. I mean, yes, it is as toxic as other working environments. But Obi, I'm really curious what you have to say with more precision and your feeling about it as a woman who joined later in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so I came here when I was 40, having worked in London most of my life. And the first thing I noticed was, where are the women and where are the Black people? Because London is so much more diverse in every single dimension, right? It really truly is a cultural melting pot. And because it's not just a single industry, like the Bay Area is so dominated by tech, you would see leaders in all sorts of fields from all sorts of backgrounds. And so I really missed it. It was very... I noticed for the first time that I was a woman, right? Like throughout my career, I'd never even thought about it. And I think the tech, I mean, it's been well documented, Me Too, there was a huge wave in technology and things are starting to shift. And then you have, with the racial injustice protests earlier this year, I would say that's the next wave. So if 2 years ago or 3 years ago with Me Too, it was the time for women to speak up and people really paying attention to women and things starting to shift, I would say now that's the same for the Black community, that we're finally sort of paying some attention to it. And the only way it's going to change over time is if we have more participation. And that traditionally just hasn't been there. So you mentioned VC, right? It's still, I think it's fewer than 5% of startup money VC money goes to female founders, and for Black founders, it's probably like 1 or 2% max. But it is starting. Yeah, but what's changed is that people are no longer okay with that, right? So I think that's what gives me a lot of encouragement, is that people are actively changing that culture and are bringing people in. So Zepp, you said something right at the beginning where you said, oh, it's all about the engineers, it's all about the coders. I actually really fundamentally disagree with that. So I think the humanities have a huge role to play, especially when you look at technologies like artificial intelligence. If we leave it to just the coders, we'll get a very one-dimensional viewpoint. And so when I think about diversity, I don't just think about gender and race and those sort of traditional dimensions, but I really think about people who bring a new viewpoint to the table just because they have a different background. And so it's like the gender or the race is almost a shortcut for it. Because I grew up as a woman, I will bring a slightly different point of view. Or if I grew up poor, or if I grew up in an urban or a rural environment. And so it's much more around bringing these different viewpoints to the table, because they'll enable us to build better products. And I really think the projects we work on, the Moonshots, they're huge, they're complex problems, and there's no way we can solve them or even begin to solve them unless we have multiple perspectives at the table.
But how do you do it? I mean, how do you bring in more voices? Sorry, Zepp, you can go right after.
Yeah. How do you do it? So you, I would say actually, first of all, you have to start with the people who are already there. So if the women and the Black people in your company have a bad experience, right, that then if you're suppressing their contributions and so on, and sometimes that's very unintentional, right? No one sort of sets out to be racist or anti-feminist. But that's where I would start. It's always like looking at the culture internally first, and then bringing more people in. And sometimes that's a question of networks. We tend to be very lazy in that we rely on the networks that grow organically. So for instance, the people we went to university with or the people we worked with in the past. And then when we look at that more objectively, we realize that means those networks are very limiting. And so we have to force ourselves to actually get outside those groups that we're familiar with and where we already the people we already hang out with, and go out and actively go and find people who are different. So and then embrace that difference, right, when they come in and not reject it.
Let's cultivate a little bit our disagreement, Obi.
Go for it.
At the beginning, I didn't want to say this is all only about writing code. I just wanted to say, as Milena was asking me about this thesis, I mean, why did I say that if Hegel would think, where's the word spirit today? I would say in Silicon Valley, I wanted to say the thesis does not only imply or not even mainly imply that it migrated, from Jena to Berlin, and now it's south of San Francisco, between San Francisco and San Jose. I want to say it's also a different type of thinking. Yeah? That's what fascinates me precisely as being as somebody who's not able to write code, but somebody who's never worked in a company like you. So precisely because it's different from the Hegelian type of thinking, which I can still identify more or less like my type of thinking. I find it fascinating. But I never implied it has to be the only one. Now, as far as the humanities are concerned, the Geisteswissenschaften, I disagree with you because you once again want to assign us the function that the humanists love. Most of my fellow humanities people love that. And that is the function of the moral authority. So therefore say, once and forever, the fact that I have practiced philosophy and read literature and written all my life, I mean, not literature, I don't like, but about literature, does not imply that I have any higher moral or ethical competence than you or any other fellow citizen. Yeah? I don't think, this is my provocation, that there can be specialists for moral obligations. As I think, Obi, you were implying, I hope you were implying that, the impulse for becoming more diverse, for example, in a company, has to come from outside the company or from inside the company, not from outside. You get my point? If it does not emerge from inside the company, if there is no energy to do that, it will always be some lame humanist from outside who, with thin lips, and pale and very resentful of Silicon Valley because they do not make 1% of the income. And humanists are very resentful by definition. Would say, you have to become more diverse, etc., etc. That can be good as a reminder, okay, but it has to come from inside, I believe. And I think that the role we can play, and I think we are partly playing, and this is something, Milena, we could maybe talk about, at Stanford University, for example, as humanists, as philosophers. You are somebody who has studied philosophy and neuroscience. That's fantastic. Is precisely this encouragement to what I like to call riskful thinking. Yeah, if then in addition, I sometimes say, isn't it weird that there are so few Black people or so few women or trans people, whatever? Terrific, but I don't want my idea to be my identity, my role, to be reduced to a role to say something that is so freaking obvious that the world would be a much better place if there was no need to say it. Don't get me wrong, there is a need to say it, but we should jointly say it and shouldn't leave this role of the moral preacher to the humanities.
I think what I was getting at is more, I'll quote a Stanford professor, Fei Li. So she's a neuroscientist and a computer scientist. And she says we shouldn't leave it to the computer scientists. And so she said, people talk about artificial intelligence, but there's actually nothing artificial about AI because no other technology is so shaped by the people who make it. And that's why it's important who the people are that make it. And if you want to make it relevant to the whole world, then you have to involve a broader range of people involving it. So she actually, she co-founded the institute at Stanford, the AI Institute, and it's called, human-centered. It's human-centered. It's a human-centered AI.
Yeah, but I mean, she is somebody who is able to found or co-found such an institute at Stanford. She's an academic. Mm-hmm. Okay. But she clearly, I mean, I've seen her we have never had a personal conversation, but, I live on campus. So
you've missed out. She's amazing in person too.
I mean, I've seen her. No, I've never, but for random reasons, it's not that I withdrew. She's probably not interested in me. I would love her to be interested in conversation. Maybe she watches this. Anyway, but she's a typical case that I would say she does not need the non-technologically involved humanists from outside, and we have such humanists, not only myself, will then remind her of the obligation of diversity. She's a very good case from the, initiation, ignition. Ignition is the word I was looking for, from inside. Yeah, I mean, that has to happen. That is important, but I think it is political correctness in the bad sense of the word if I think people like myself who call themselves humanists, who do philosophy, have a higher authority and competence. And I would once again go so far, and this is not the discussion we are having, but as far as ethical moral competence, I think this cannot be a profession-specific competence. And this has to be a competence that has to include every fellow citizen, including fellow citizens who voted for this strange, still president of the United States.
I agree with that. So, for instance, we discussed how can we bring ethics into X, and we decided not to hire a sort of resident ethicist who would then sit in the corner and that would be their job, is to do the ethics. But instead, what we're doing is we run a series of workshops with product managers, with designers, with engineers, where we discuss ethical questions, and they're very kind of case study based. So it's related to things that they're building, right? And it's much more around getting them to build it into the entire design process, right? From the build ethics into the design process, as opposed to it's like something that you do at the end. That doesn't work. I completely agree.
And what I think, what I hope you're doing in such a context, and what I think one should do, is not just to confirm and to cultivate, like what people like yourself and myself already kind of know. I bet, if you and I would sit together and figure out how to run a company ethically, we would have 90% overlap and 10% to be discussed. I think it is important to take into account certain eccentric, surprising, for us problematic opinions of those who are involved. Yeah? I mean, that maybe sometimes, this is, not that I care about the outgoing president once again, but this example of what I think intellectuals have been wrong about for the longest time, to not take them seriously, to be condescending, to say that they're fascist is wrong. So one has to take into account people who do not belong by their background, by their education, or by their professional interest, who may not agree with us, but are still concerned. And that is very, very important.
So you would say you also needed diversity of opinions and beliefs, not only of identities.
Yeah, but there's a difference. What I mean is a difference that everybody, of course, will always, as Obi was implying, we are in the gender openness, we are equality, everything. And that's good. But there may be a difference between being in favor of diversity and a true openness and tolerance for diversity. Yeah? Lots of people, I have the impression that lots of people whose every second word is diversity, when all of a sudden they encounter diversity, they talk, the others are fascists. Exaggerate. But this is very, very, or how can Chicanos, God forbid, or Latinos in Florida vote for Trump? I mean, I terribly regret something like that to happen. I mean, I can't do that because I'm an emeritus, so I'm not speaking I'm only speaking my own behalf. But the important question is, if I disagree with that, not to tell them that they are wrong, or not to tell them that they're stupid or, God forbid, fascist. No. How does this happen? And I think this also has to happen more aggressively in Silicon Valley.
I agree. And actually, the hippies had it right there. So more love. Because if you lead with love, at least if you don't get there all the way, you'll be left with empathy. And I think that is what we all need more, is more empathy.
It's a funny detail and footnote, I mean, and I cannot explain why and how, but this doctoral student whom I was mentioning before, and I was mentioning by name, but he would be proud about what I'm saying now. He actually, for me, for weird reasons, is a Trump supporter. Huh? And I can have endless, interesting discussions with him about that. I've never persuaded him to not do that. Plus, it's not my task, really, as a doctoral advisor also. But you get my point. I mean, this is weird. I disagree, but it is important to think about it. It is important. I think I'm very, very grateful. I mean, he's not the typical Silicon Valley inhabitant, but that he's open for it. And to a certain way, Obi, I think it is typical that somebody who's so open and retrospectively so much identifies with the hippie culture as he does, gives himself that freedom. My point, this freedom of eccentricity, which I, of course, hope and pray he will soon overcome.
Okay, I promised that we wouldn't go too deep into politics, because the last few months have been too much of it, too much of election and the president and stuff like that. So let's maybe shift the conversation a little bit more to the innovation part again, because diversity obviously is related to innovation. And we have a question from a viewer. He or she, I can't see, unfortunately, asked, I'm intrigued about the previous discussion of flying cars, as this sci-fi invention is what David Graeber mentions to illustrate the decline in innovation in the mid to late 20th century. And he says that according to many scientists in the 1950s, we were supposed to have flying cars by now. But Graeber attributes this lack of innovation to changes in capitalism and bureaucracy beginning in the 1970s. And I was interested, Obi, what is your take on that? Because it's true, we don't have flying cars yet, although many predicted it. But would you agree with this assessment that we have a decline of innovation in the recent years?
So, well, if you want to be semantic about it, there's a distinction between invention and innovation, right? So inventions you can measure just by number of patents, I guess, and I think that's still going up. But I'm actually more interested in the applied side. So how can we take the inventions that typically come out of universities like Stanford, where all the basic research happens and even a lot of the applied research happens, and then turn them into things that solve real problems in the world? So do we need flying cars? I think that's an interesting question. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. So I would actually flip it and say it's not so much are we inventing enough new technologies, because the technology is only ever the tool. Are we using that technology in an effective way that's being invented in an effective way to actually solve real problems? So if you look at like lists of real problems like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, how are we using technology to make a dent into climate change or health or, real world problems? How can we produce food more sustainably? How can we keep our oceans healthy? So that's kind of what propels me much more than worrying about whether we're inventing enough stuff. Because this is one of the issues. Like if you only have the engineers in charge, they fall in love with the technology and they could keep inventing forever. But you need to always have that other lens too of like, what is this technology for? Otherwise you build stuff that people don't want, or that's not actually useful, or at its worst harmful in the world.
If I may say something to the person who asked us the question about the flying car, there's another student of mine, so I can talk about my former students. There is actually a company in Slovakia, out of all places, but run by two, I think, if I'm well informed, by two former Stanford graduates who do produce flying cars. The problem is that they cannot really find a good proportion between price and market. Also, I mean, I always thought it is one of those ideas that you can characterize of the future of the past. I mean, the flying car looked like a future when I was 20 years old, or when I was 15 years old. And today, like you were saying indirectly and politely, Obi, why would you want a flying car? Yeah, maybe we are out of this type of locomotion anyway. But I mean, more importantly for me, I think this idea of futures of the past, and then one has to be able to say, okay, that doesn't no longer look like the future. You don't have to hold on to that. That would be a strength. I mean, I think my former student whom I really love and with whom I'm in contact should have dropped that idea and done something different. Obi, my real question is this. So when you were saying solving problems, yeah, you had an established horizon of problems. So climate change, sustainable food, etc., etc. And I think all these, there's a common denominator or a vanishing point of all these problems. And the vanishing point of that is to assure the longevity of humankind on the planet or in the universe. Yeah? I mean, as much as
longevity of the planet. I would say right now we're doing okay.
Why would you care about the planet?
We're destroying the planet in the process.
Destroy the planet, but I mean, you would be wanted. I have no specific relation to the planet. I mean, I cannot change it, but I mean, okay, but I mean, the condition is, and I want to go beyond that. The condition is to say, okay, if we can preserve the planet, that will extend the possibility for humankind to survive, I don't know, for X generations. Right? So you can, of course, discuss that endlessly, but now, what would you say about a humanist like myself who would say, well, the idea, I'm not saying I'm right, but is this my task to bring up such ideas? The idea that humankind can endlessly extend its presence on this planet or in the universe from an evolutionary point of view is so unlikely that we should also think, or rather think, about what could be a dignified form of farewell of humankind from the planet. Now, I'm happy that you're laughing about it, but that's a serious question. I mean, not dignified farewell that you say, oh, goodbye or bye-bye, dear planet, or something like that. But can we say, okay, maybe, I mean, is it the task of humanity is to say maybe the real assignment is to think, well, this will not be possible. Extending the presence of humankind on the planet is so expensive, not only financially expensive, but implies so many reductions for our life that perhaps we say, spend another 100,000 years and then bye-bye. I mean,
and go the way of the dinosaurs.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not about the dinosaurs. Clearly, didn't have that decision, didn't make that decision. But no, but again, I mean, you get my point. Everybody's agreeing on this extension. I find this extension sometimes very unlikely. There has not been any species on the planet that has survived forever. I mean, sharks are quite good at surviving. Humans are probably not so good at surviving. I mean, get my point.
But Zep, we're not just destroying it for ourselves. We're destroying it for the rest of the species. It's not that we're destroying the planet for ourselves. We're destroying it for everyone else as well, for all the other species.
Okay, then,
so,
I would say we have to discuss. I mean, can we really assume arrogantly a responsibility for all other species?
No, but I think we do have to take responsibility for our actions that affect them.
Yeah, our own.
I mean, that's sort of like at the heart of the ethics there.
I think we could. I mean, okay. I mean, it's about experimenting about what the humanists can do or should do. I would, for example, say we can only have responsibility and we can only claim that we represent, for example, animal rights if we could have a communication with animals about that, which we can't. Can we?
Depends who you talk to. I mean, I wanted to bring it back to something specific in this. So in climate for instance. So that's actually one of the areas where the technologists have a role to play, and we do need breakthrough technologies in order to address the climate crisis. But clearly, technology is not the only part of the answer. So climate change to me is a perfect example of a problem where you need multiple different factions. You need to have politicians and policymakers. You need to have economists and business people who think about new business models. Because if you just invent the technology and then you find that you can't, for instance, make the economics work, that's something we've experienced multiple times. One of my favorite projects at X was called Foghorn, and it was about removing carbon from the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So this is a number of years ago, when this seemed perhaps less urgent than it does today. And so our idea was we would pull the carbon dioxide out of the ocean, because the ocean acts as a huge carbon sink that constantly pulls carbon dioxide out of the air. And then we would combine it with sustainable hydrogen to make a synthetic fuel that you could then burn in any car, because there's over 1 billion cars in the world that are not going to suddenly be electric overnight. Or indeed in airplanes, where the energy density of batteries isn't there yet. And the team set themselves a goal that this fuel would be, in terms of pricing, comparable with oil-based fuel. Mm-hmm. And that's what didn't work. So we could actually make it. I have a little vial of sea fuel that sits on my desk, gathering dust now. The desk, I haven't been there for months. But we couldn't make it cheap enough. And so that's where you then have some sort of interesting question, like, is the cost of fuel today that's only reflecting extracting the oil and refining the oil and shipping it and selling it, or should that price actually reflect the impact on the environment to some extent? So until sort of, and that's a society problem, that's nothing to do with the technology. Like oil companies can make the extraction cheaper and cheaper, and environmental scientists can make the alternative technologies cheaper and cheaper, as we've seen with wind and solar, and that has a huge impact when that happens. But ultimately, in order to get some of these technologies out into the real world and through that valley of death of where they're just not economically sustainable, we need
super example to be. And I ask you now a question that's not an experimental question, but a real question, although we have accumulating chat questions. But anyway, here's my real question. I mean, so it's clear what the advantage of this alternative fuel would be, but the price is very, very high. Should it be produced? Should it become even obligatory to use that fuel that has huge ecological advantages, or should we continue with other fuel? So who's going to make this decision? I think definitely not humanists and specialists for ethics. That would be, in this way, authoritarian. I mean, they would all say, of course, we have the fuel because, and people who own cars are anyway, of course, we have Teslas in my family. It's actually true. But anyway, yeah, I mean, politicians, well, I mean, I do think, and that's my question to you, do you think this is viable? What we need is a culture of plebiscite, like in Switzerland, for example. Yeah, I mean, where many decisions that look tiny, or like these decisions that in many American states, like in California, when there's a presidential elections, we had 24 other things to vote upon in California. And it's sometimes questions of this kind. And I think there is no other basis to decide than by a majority of people who are concerned. What do you think about that? Should one or not? Or do you think that there can be any specialists who can decide that for the majority?
I think it's a fascinating question. So specialists actually aren't necessarily the best at predicting the future. Because they overestimate their own abilities to do that. But they can certainly be an input and a voice, right? So listening to scientists on things like climate change and public health is incredibly important, as we're experiencing at the moment. But then they need to be mixed with other voices. So I'm actually agnostic on the political system. I sort of always felt like we're experimenting with all of these, and it's sort of the worst.
This is not one of those political questions that we had decided not to ask, and I was going into it, but I didn't even want to talk about the president. I just wanted to say, we have to take people seriously who have a different mind frame from ours. And this one here is not a political question in that sense, because it's completely content free. The question is, and I may have also no answer, but you know, I mean, my hunch would be that if you ask this fuel question and say fuel is much more expensive, that a huge majority would say, no, we don't want this fuel because it's too expensive and I want to spend my money on vacation, on booze, on God knows what, right? I think they would be wrong. I mean, I, unsurprisingly, would be in favor of that much more expensive fuel, also because I have an electric car.
But that's a question of how do you ask the question, right? Like, nobody's going to say, yes, please charge me more money for fuel. Yeah. But if you put it into a different context, or if you just make the alternative, the oil-based fuel, expensive as well, you know, then it's a different question.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, there's a tendency. I mean, we're not talking much about Silicon Valley, but there's a world tendency. I think it's actually more a European problem. That governments, based on advisors who play the role of authority, make decisions that go clearly against the majority. And as you're saying, I have no solution, but it's a real question that is not asked frequently enough. Whereas I do think that Silicon Valley is ultimately driven by the market, right? I mean, you know that, is it? I mean, you produce something if you can find a market for it, or not.
Yes, I mean, that's the only things that scale. So, I mean, to me, it's ultimately, it will have to find a market. So we sometimes talk about purpose and profit being interlinked, because we start with the purpose. So can we solve a real important problem in the world? But then the way the solution will scale and get widespread adoption is only if it becomes profitable. And that's what I mean with climate change. There's some solutions that we clearly need as a world, but with the current economic setup, it's difficult to make them profitable. So we have to look beyond it, right?
You drop the fuel problem. You drop the fuel. You had a solution, a scientific, a practical solution, an engineering solution for the fuel production. You dropped it because of no market. And now you have to say, from an ethical point of view, that was very evil, but I think it's okay.
Well, we actually said, like, at the time when the team decided to shut that project down, the thing that convinced me, because I fought it at first, I said, no, we should keep going, you know, maybe oil will go up again in price, etc. Although that did not happen. So I was clearly wrong about predicting the future of commodities there. But what the team did to convince me why we should drop that particular project at the time, they said, there's other things in climate change that we can work on that are more urgent that we should do first. So an example was energy storage. A lot of wind and solar energy gets thrown away because the grid can't absorb it. So that same team that was working on Foghorn actually then pitched another project called Malta, which was an invention from a Stanford physicist, I believe, who postulated, like, what if we have this kind of closed cycle where we take electricity, we turn it into heat, we store it in vats of hot salt, and then we can use turbines to turn it back into electricity when we need it. So it's a little bit like having hydro, but without needing a mountain. You could put it anywhere. You could put it into an old coal plant. And that became a project called Malta, which then spun out and is now an independent company.
I think
so sometimes it's about the timing. I do think we will need to make, as a society, not necessarily us as X, but like someone will need to make air capture and removal of CO2 from the atmosphere work.
I think that I'd like to bring up a question from the audience from Joshua Walker, because it quite fits quite well into the discussion we're having right now. He asked, what is the role or moral responsibility of entrepreneurs to pursue socially and ecological responsible solutions to real problems on climate change? And I think this plays a little bit into what you've been saying earlier, that or also what the comment before said, that Silicon Valley is good at solving problems, but are they the real problems they should solve? Or are we addressing the wrong problems? You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and nobody really, I think it's important as a reminder historically I don't think that the invention of electronic technology that is enabling us to have the chat that we are having at this point, that has enabled Joshua to come in with his question, etc., etc. But that was never a project. Yeah, I mean, when I was, let's say, I graduated from high school in 1967, we didn't imagine to have that type of conversation. That was not. It happened. Yeah, it happened, and I think it is much more an example of what I was illustrating before by this German word of Zufall. Yeah, I mean, in the sense also of randomness of the Zufall. Well, it happened, and then people pursued it. You know, search engines. So when I came here, there were no search engines. All of a sudden, the Google founders had the idea of search engines. That had a certain goal. But I mean, how search engines have transformed our relationship to knowledge. You know, and if you saw I normally work my desk, the whole background, the huge shelves with encyclopedias that have all covered dust because I'm not using them anymore. Who would look in the historisches Wörterbuch der Philosophie, the definition of a word? You don't do that anymore. Okay, so, but this was not a project. Now, Silicon Valley is this. My question back to Joshua, and the question about the moral responsibility is, I think it's the same question that Obi and I had already. Can there be specialists for moral responsibility? You always act as if there were, but only as long as we all agree. Yeah, I mean, if everybody concerned agrees, then can it easily be. So Joshua and Obi and I sense from Joshua's question, we would easily agree. But maybe lots of people would not agree because they don't want this, much more expensive fuel, or because they ultimately would prefer to have a good time on the planet themselves and not anticipate what will happen in N generations, and it will no longer be possible to survive. I mean, what I'm emphasizing here is a certain democratic component of those, including those who are really concerned, that we forget too easily, not in Silicon Valley necessarily, but if we talk humanities people, ethical people, political people, about moral responsibility. Okay? Whose moral responsibility? I mean, are we running the world?
Well, I guess we all have a moral responsibility. I mean, we're all German, and I think this is where maybe we just need to think beyond Silicon Valley, right? Not every technology innovation ever came from here, and it certainly won't in the future. And there's an argument that maybe we've peaked, that people are starting to move out of the valley anyway, and COVID is accelerating that process. But it's like a solution like direct air capture, for instance, might come out of a German startup, because in Germany, the society as a whole does place more value on having ecological responsibilities. So, and people are willing perhaps more to pay a little bit more for their fuel, right, than if you go into the middle of the United States, for instance. So I think as innovation shifts from these hubs, maybe in the old days it was Bell Labs on the East Coast, and then for the last, however many decades it was Silicon Valley here, I think it's rapidly dispersing. And I see that in two ways. So one is you have lots and lots of startup hubs that are happening all over the world. The city I grew up in, Berlin, before the end of the 90s, there was no tech startups. And then there was a couple, and eBay bought one and sort of made it bigger. And then suddenly you had a sort of thriving e-commerce ecosystem. And now you have a lot of AI startups and so on. Healthcare is becoming health tech is becoming a real hub. So that is happening, is that there's all these hubs springing up all over the place, from, Kenya to Singapore to Berlin to Estonia. And then the other thing that is happening is that companies are becoming more distributed. So there's a number of companies now that don't even have an office anymore. And one that talks about this very vocally is Matt Mullenweg, who's the founder of WordPress. That about 30% of the internet runs on WordPress. People don't really know this. But they used to have they were kind of classic San Francisco-based startup. They used to have an office here, and then they would open offices in other places and so on. But they made it very easy to work remote. This was years and years before COVID. And so in the end, the offices were so underused that they ended up closing the office, and they used the money instead to get people together periodically for sort of offsites where they could co-create in person, but other than that, people work from home. So it's now a completely distributed company, with the exception of Tumblr, because they bought Tumblr and they came with a New York office. So now they have an office again. But it showed that that was possible. And then lots of other companies completely resisted it. Even Google, we have all been able to work from home because we have our laptops and all of our things are in the cloud. But we resisted it until we had to suddenly with COVID. And so what's happening now is that people are moving out, like rent prices in San Francisco that were at ridiculous, totally unsustainable highs have dropped by 20-30% within months.
So are you saying, Zep, go ahead.
But just it's relatively short. I do think this is interesting because before COVID, the conditions that we were talking about, electronic technology is the one technology that more than any predecessor has made co-presence in space irrelevant. I love co-presence in space, but we can talk here quite successfully, quite productively, as far as I'm concerned, and don't need co-presence. And yet, before COVID, as Obi was implying, the rentals in Silicon Valley were through the roof. People wanted to be there, although it is very difficult to explain why people wanted to be in Silicon Valley. The point I wanted to underline is that it may well be true that as a COVID imposed upon condition, and I'm coughing, maybe, I test positive tomorrow. So anyway, a COVID imposed condition.
Good thing we're not in person, Zep.
Yeah, no, it happened precisely because we didn't meet in person. But that this is the discontinuity that brings Silicon Valley as a space to an end. Yeah, we realize, Milena is in Düsseldorf, and it makes no difference. She's not closer or further away from. For Obi and me, it would be 40 minutes to meet. In 20 minutes, actually, we both move, right? We move somewhere to 80. We meet, but it doesn't make a difference. So that could be a historical turning point. I don't think that Silicon Valley will last forever, and then somebody will ask the next Hegel question: where is it going to move? Maybe to Nigeria. My question for you, Obi, is, or maybe also for those who listen to us, don't you think that there is a tension or problem between too much moral responsibility and too much moral conditions in mind, as you have in Germany, for example, on the one hand, and innovation on the other hand? If you constantly say, but this we have to eliminate because it would not be. Yes, I think German society may be number one in the world. I don't know, in terms of ecological responsibility, and I think it's a good thing. But at the same time, as an eminent German politician and Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg, maybe the most productive federal state in Germany, once said, it is an mistake-avoiding culture and not a risk-taking culture. Yeah, this is the only green prime minister, very successful, very, very intelligent man, very impressed by him. But even he says, implies that there is a tension between high moral responsibility and a huge amount of innovation. What do you think about that?
Well, I think actually in climate change, that's the chance, right? Yeah. So if you're trying to avoid the risk of the whole planet melting down, then you have to invest in the innovation. So maybe that's how they can resolve that particular paradox.
That's a nice one. Okay, good.
But I can hear from your answers that there might be a situation we're in now where it's time to maybe not disrupt Silicon Valley, but to reinvent it in a sense. I really like the point you brought up, Obi, that maybe we will see some more hubs emerging, and the world spirit maybe moving to other places and being distributed. Maybe that is the new
distributed,
the new way of the world spirit, which is also distributed digitally worldwide. Who knows? Unfortunately, I think we could discuss on for many more minutes, but unfortunately, we're coming to an end. So I would really like to thank you very much for taking the time to be here. It was a real pleasure talking to you, really fascinating. And also Thanks very, very much for everyone joining in online, listening, posting their questions. And I really would like to meet again in maybe 5 years and see how Silicon Valley has changed since then. So maybe one last quick question. What do you think if we met again in 5 years? How will Silicon Valley look like? Will there even be physical offices anymore in Silicon Valley?
Definitely. I think the gravitational pull is still very strong. I just think it won't be so unique anymore. And I think people will change the way they relate to it. So do I want to go back to commuting an hour and a half each way 4 days a week? No. So getting together in person and having this sort of mixing pot that Silicon Valley is, that ecosystem, is incredibly important, but maybe we can find different ways of doing that. Including, do I want international air travel to start again? Yes, but we just have to make the airplanes more sustainable.
Seb, how about you?
Milena, I want to insist in the first place that we should have this meeting no later than in 5 years, because I've been enjoying it a lot, and you look like you were enjoying it a lot. That is also something, if we were together in space, we would have more certainty whether we would really enjoy it. For me, it was this kind of clicking of feelings that doesn't happen as well with the screen. No, but I want it in 5 years, because as I'm by far the oldest one, I'm going to be 77 and with an increased risk of disappearing. So I want it to happen while I'm still alive. Secondly, I want to share with you a strange vision that I have. It's not a vision like I'm a visionary, but so I live on Stanford campus. Our house is on Stanford campus, but it's a huge campus. So, and 2 days a week, I walk to Central Campus to Green Library, which is kind of the heart of campus, just to have for a change. In these COVID times, there's a certain risk that one doesn't have enough change. And ever since COVID started, because in the first, Stanford was so shocked as an institution the first couple of weeks that they didn't cut the lawn. And all of a sudden, the lawn was growing. And ever since, I have developed this obsessive imagination of Stanford being a future Atlantis in the first stage of becoming Atlantis. Yeah? They have meanwhile cut the lawn, but I'm still imagining the lawn is growing and growing and growing. And in 500 or 5,000 years, when I will definitely not be alive anymore, so there will be archaeologists, from Togo or from Nigeria, from wherever, and they will fly here or wherever. Maybe they fly in a different way then, like angels, and it will start digging. And they say, oh my God, there was this strange institution existing there. And that institution only had a span of 110 years and was very, very successful. And then they will discover it was a university, and they're going to ask, what is a university? And then they will realize that the very quick decline, a little bit like the dinosaurs that we have mentioned. Nobody knows why the dinosaurs disappeared. Maybe, it was a meteor that hit the planet Earth. So it was, in that sense, COVID. It may have come to an ending. That is not a very qualified answer. And if I'm asking myself, and that's my third and last statement, in a kind of Freudian way, like Dr. Freud, I think I'm so obsessed with this idea of Silicon Valley and Stanford disappearing, because in the 31 years that I've been living here, that is not quite 50% of my life, but almost, I have developed really deep existential roots. I feel this is my place in a strange way. And I know Obi does have different feelings, not negative feelings, but different feelings. But for me, this has become really my place. It has really become what you call in German Heimat. And I'm very patriotic about it. Although my father, this is what patriotism means, was not born here, although I was not born. So it also, not only for me, has this dimension of being a place in which you like to dwell, although given its comparative diversity, given, that I don't think it will ever develop a history of a span of 500 to 1,000 years. It will be a short-lived history. Seems to be counter to this feeling. So, this is welcome to my beginning Atlantis, Stanford.
Maybe more like Tikal. Tikal in Guatemala, which is overgrown by the jungle when the Mayan civilization came to a sudden end.
Something like that. This is the idea.
I really like that idea. Who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll have medicine that can make us age for 500 years. So we might live to experience that. Who knows? But I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much for taking the time and to be here in this virtual space together. Thanks to the audience again, and also a big thank you to the Thomas Mann House for bringing us together. And I wish every one of you a wonderful rest of the day. And I can only say take care and stay healthy.
And thanks for having the San Francisco poster in the background, Milena. That was very moving. Bye-bye.
And maybe one day we'll say it was fun to be part of one of these brigadoons.
Yes, that's.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.